Welcome to CIHT Podcasts.
In 2019, the Secretary of State for Transport asked the Department of Transport to carry out an evidence stocktake to gather the facts on the safety of smart motorways and make recommendations. So the question is, are smart motorways safe? Welcome to the CIHT podcast. I'm your host, Justin Ward. After the review concluded, Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary, reported that per 100 million miles driven, there are fewer deaths on smart motorways than conventional ones. And the focus on smart motorways has also been in the sights of the Transport Select Committee. On the 16th of June 2021, CIHT's fellow Kate Carpenter gave evidence on behalf of CIHT to the Select Committee hearing on smart motorways. So I'm delighted to be joined by Kate today, and you'll be able to hear extracts of the evidence that Kate gave later on in this podcast. So welcome, Kate.
Thanks, Justin.
Before we get into the detail of the safety case for or against smart motorways, could you just explain what is meant by a smart motorway and perhaps the sort of different types that exist?
Of course, yeah. And I think people do find this quite confusing, which I understand. So smart relates to a combination of changing how the hard shoulder works, plus using technology to make motorways operate more efficiently and safely. So the three different types. The first type, which is what we've got on the M25 at Heathrow, was the first one that came in, and that's called controlled motorway. And that keeps the hard shoulder, but it uses technology to improve smoothness and efficiency of traffic flow. And I'll explain what that technology is in a moment. The second type, which came in following that and was first trialled on the M42, is called dynamic hard shoulder. And that's where the hard shoulder is converted to a running lane at peak times. So typically in the morning and evening peak in weekdays, typically, the hard shoulder is open as a running lane. And at other times, it's retained as a hard shoulder and you can't travel in it. And signs over the hard shoulder tell you whether you can use it or not. And then the third type is called all lane running. And that was introduced in response to realizing that dynamic hard shoulder, keeping the hard shoulder off peak seemed intuitively the best thing to do. But actually, it makes a more complicated environment for drivers to understand. So all lane running is the same all the time. It converts the hard shoulder to a running lane all the time, but it uses the same technology broadly. So the technology we use is a toolkit. We use what we call mandatory variable speed limit. That's red ring speed limits, either over each lane or on a sign at the side of the road, which are enforced by cameras. And these are activated automatically when traffic starts slowing down in result of congestion or a collision. That slowing of traffic is detected and speed limits are put up automatically. So it's a very efficient process, and it helps reduce shunts further back down the road as traffic starts to build up. So that's the first bit of technology. In many ways, that's the most powerful bit. Another piece is called lane control. So that's using electronic signals to divert traffic out of a lane. For example, if there's a breakdown or workers in the road downstream. So you'll see a lane divert arrow, a white arrow pointing out of your lane. And then further along the road, you'll see a red X over your lane or on a side gantry at the side indicating which lanes are closed. So that lane control is about worker safety as well as user safety, and it's enabling us to use the lanes more efficiently. So, for example, if there's a breakdown, instead of closing the whole motorway, we can keep some lanes moving and stop lanes in which there's an obstruction. And then there's other supporting technology. MIDAS is the instant detection equipment that makes the variable speed limit work, and that's either loops in the carriageway or radar at the side of the carriageway and CCTV, so that workers in a control centre can look at the network and see what's happening. And what's being added to this toolkit, really important, is what's called stop vehicle detection, and that's technology where if a vehicle becomes stationary, particularly in the off-peak time, it will be automatically detected, an alert will come up in the control centre, and they can activate reduced speed limit and warnings for drivers. And that's the new bit of the toolkit, which is really useful. In the peak time, if somebody stops, actually the flow breaks down very quickly and the automated technology works very quickly. But it's the off-peak time when stop vehicle detection is particularly helpful.
In the evidence you gave, you referenced the recently published Smart Motorway Stocktake document, which showed that fatal crashes and live lane fatal crashes are lower per mile travelled on all forms of smart motorway, controlled motorway, dynamic hard shoulder, and all lane running than conventional motorways with hard shoulders. This finding, particularly the evidence on live lane fatal crashes being lower per mile travelled, is particularly interesting in being a counterintuitive outcome. Could you explain why this may be the case?
Yes, I agree. And it is counterintuitive. And my own response when I first heard about smart motorway the change in use of the hard shoulder particularly was that I thought it might improve, or it would improve capacity, but it might worsen safety. And the counterintuitive bit is particularly interesting to me. I think it helps to see it in parts of two pieces of the jigsaw. The first part is the pure physical part. If you get a catastrophic emergency, such as engine seizes, then the vehicle can't be driven. The vehicle is stranded, and if there isn't a hard shoulder that vehicle can coast into using its remaining speed, then that vehicle is stationary, and you have more live lane stops. So that physical thing, I think there's no sort of difference of views about it. The other bit of the jigsaw that I think we don't necessarily understand so much about is the behavioural side. So what drivers choose to do changes in the context of the place where they are. So, for example, most stops on motorways are illegal discretionary stops. They are people choosing to stop for all sorts of reasons: get the phone out of the boot, make a phone call, feed the baby, change baby's nappy, make a loose stop, all the different things that people do in normal life on motorways. They're illegal. All those things are illegal. They're not emergencies, but they happen very, very frequently, and they happen on smart motorways as well. They happen in emergency refuge areas and so on. But when you remove the hard shoulder, you get fewer of them. So that's a really important finding. The other sorts of things that you get is people, for example, if they get, say, their engine's making a funny noise, they might stop on a hard shoulder ordinarily, which isn't a safe place. There are many fatal crashes have happened on hard shoulders, conventional hard shoulders. So people think it's a safe place in some respects, but it isn't. So people might continue to a refuge lay-by, or they might continue to the next exit rather than stop in a live lane. They might keep their cars fueled better. If they hear about people who run out of fuel and are then involved in collisions, they might be better at keeping their cars properly fueled, not just for the journey they're making, but anticipating maybe there'll be a slowdown and they will have to travel at a lower speed and use more fuel. So there's lots of things that maybe people wouldn't, they change their behaviour in ways we didn't anticipate. And one of the interesting things we found is eye tracking analysis being done. This is monitoring people who are driving on motorways with and without hard shoulders. And when there's a hard shoulder present, people keep looking in the hard shoulder. Even when there's nothing there, they're looking in it, and they're probably not even aware they're doing it. But it means when somebody stops in their lane, they may not notice them. If they've been looking in the hard shoulder and they look back in their lane, they may not notice that somebody's stopped or somebody's moved into their lane suddenly. So that's counterintuitive, but it does explain why we do indeed see fewer deaths per mile on all different forms of smart motorway. On controlled motorway, dynamic hard shoulder, and all lane running, the fatality rate per mile is less than on conventional motorways.
And it's interesting, that behavioural side. I think the recent More or Less programme on the radio that focused on smart motorways did actually include a bit on that behavioural side about how people modify their behaviour. For instance, the cameras are there so people maybe comply a bit more. You have more compliance with speed limits, for instance, and that reduces other risk factors in terms of accidents. But that also had an interesting finding in terms of validating the figure that Grant Shapps reported on the 100 million miles travel. And can you just explain what that finding was? Because I think that's an interesting context point as well.
Right, it is. And the fact that a feeling of danger, Tim Harford described it very well in More or Less, the feeling of danger can actually make drivers take more care, and I think that's quite helpful. The idea that some collision types go down and others go up is indeed correct, and it's possible counterintuitively people tend to focus understandably on live lane collisions as a type of collision, but that there are many types of collisions involving lane changing or excessive speed resulting in shunts or careless merging and diverging. And in the analysis of smart motorway safety, we look at over 130 hazards for every single scheme. So it is a sort of thorough analysis. That combination of something's getting better, something's getting worse, and in net terms it getting better is quite a sort of powerful message to grasp. And that people expect live lane collisions to go up, but as I've described, they don't. And some analysis was done by a PhD student of Professor Oliver Carston at Leeds, and they found that the same finding. They independently analysed the collisions and the traffic flow, and found that collisions on smart motorways did go down, not up. And it is counterintuitive, but that is the finding. And one of the things that Oliver Carston explained on More or Less, which I think is helpful, is if you alleviate congestion, you reduce the flow breakdowns that can result in a lot of shunts. So the kind of stop-start, people not expecting a queue and then suddenly finding a queue. And that's where technology is really helpful. That although over time that traffic flow will increase, and one of the things CIHT called for is to, that we need to understand the potential climate change effect of increasing road capacity and increasing travel is, as part of the jigsaw and mustn't be ignored. But even if those queues return, the technology will make a given situation safer because it gives early warning to drivers, it smooths traffic flow, and it improves compliance with speed limits.
The research looked at the fatalities before the stretches of road were converted and found that fatalities had fallen after the smart motorways were implemented.
Right.
Yeah,
that's right. It's quite a complex picture because you need to look at an individual scheme over time, its collision involvement before the change was made, and its collision involvement after the change was made, in each case per million miles travelled as well as per mile of motorway. You need to compare it with roads that weren't changed. And the stocktake document looks at the collective data set that is smart motorways in each of the three types. And then separately it looks at the conventional motorway, which retains a hard shoulder, and it compares the two. And you need to look at both. In road safety engineering, we look at both those things, and you're trying to establish, are there other factors that might change, what's happened? Have new roads been opened, and therefore a road that previously had lots of, flow breakdown or, very high traffic flows as traffic changed on that route? Other things happen on a network, and you need a wider thinking, as well as looking at before and after, and looking at the different types at any particular point in time.
And what's interesting is that road users don't feel safe, and we alluded that actually that has a potential and sort of recognised safety benefit in that they modify their behaviour. But that's still an issue that needs to be addressed. RAC, AA have reported that motorists don't feel safe. So what do you think the industry needs to do? Do you think the argument for smart motorways, that the public argument's been lost already, or do you think there's a way that can be addressed in terms of just explaining in a better way about actually that they are safer? I mean, what's required there? It's a complicated issue, I think.
It is. You're absolutely right. The fears are real, and although we don't have quantified information about the fears, there's no doubt that a very large number of people are extremely anxious. Partly because poor quality reporting, for example, reporting the number of deaths on smart motorways without reporting the comparable deaths on a comparable extent of conventional motorway. And, for me, that's poor journalistic standards. You should ask, is there, as Tim Harford would say, is this a big number? What are we comparing it with? And making sure we're comparing like for like on comparable terms. You don't compare a very busy smart motorway with an almost empty conventional motorway, for example. We should be comparing like with like, and it's very important that we do that. So the fears are real, and the consequence of that fear is that people may divert onto other roads where they're much more likely to have a serious or fatal collision. So our motorways are the safest in Europe, among the very safest in the world. All types of motorway in the UK are in the safest of the world category. And if people choose to divert onto A roads, where just the physical nature of them is that it's a less forgiving environment. You've got, junctions with all movements and so on, rather than, very controlled form that you have on motorways, then people are more likely to be harmed if they choose a journey route that goes in a different way. So I think what we need to do is make sure it's clear to people that motorways are our safest roads. Our motorways are safer than pretty much anyone else's motorways. Our smart motorways are safer than other motorways. And to some extent, once the fear is in place, it can be quite hard to alleviate that. But the transparency of, what has happened and making sure it's very open and honest. Obviously, there's some confidential information that can't be shared, but making sure people understand. I think one of the really important things is people understanding what they can do to keep themselves safe. And it's partly the things I talked about, keeping fuel in your car, making sure that the tyres are in good condition. A lot of motorway emergencies are due to poor tyres, which is avoidable. So there are things that people can do themselves, and giving them that information, I think, is helpful, rather than sort of focusing on smart motorways on all roads. And most roads in Britain don't have a hard shoulder. So on all of those roads, the same principles apply. Keeping your vehicle in good condition so you don't have a breakdown is your best scenario. And I think, being very open about the data is really important, but understanding people's fear rather than just discounting it, which I have seen some people do, is not helpful. Being open and respecting that fear and understanding it, I think, is critical.
It's an interesting context to be looking at this in terms of COVID and understanding of, I think, the public discourse around risk as well, and about people's personal risk, societal risk. I think there's maybe as a collective we're getting exposed to understanding and discussing risk more than we have done previously, and climate change is another risk that we're all kind of trying to understand and get to grips with. So I think smart motorways, I think that transparency, the data, but also the understanding, the kind of emotional side of it as well, and the behavioural side is got to be core to how the industry responds. I think to the government review and the Transport Select Committee review, that's got to be a clear message, and that came across very well when you gave evidence, I think, to the Select Committee. So it'll be interesting to now pass over to the sort of highlights of the Select Committee, where I think we'll hear the start where Hugh Merriman, the chair of the Select Committee, asks you to introduce yourself. So we'll just pass over to that clip now. But thanks very much for your time, Kate. That was really interesting, and thanks again.
You're very welcome. And it was a privilege to represent the CIHT, our members, and public issues in this opportunity where there has been some poor reporting, and helping people understand the facts, I think, is really important.
Perhaps if you can just introduce yourself, your name and rank, and your link to smart motorways.
I'm representing the Chartered Institution of Highways and Transportation, a professional institution which represents professionals working in the planning, design, building, management and maintenance of highway infrastructure. I'm a chartered civil engineer. I'm a fellow of the Society of Road Safety Auditors, been working in road safety for 23 years, and I've been working in smart motorway safety governance since 2009. Specifically, so safety governance is the specialism within highways improvements that is the sort of critical friend that holds designers and highway authorities to account. So our role is to ask the difficult questions. Okay, great.
So,
that's what I've been doing.
Sorry, Kate, thank you very much. My role also to ask difficult questions as well. First of all, just to start off, and I want to ask about whether you feel we need more smart motorways rather than fewer. Let's start with Kate.
So the objective of smart motorways is to improve capacity at the lowest operational cost, as mentioned in previous discussion. Importantly, without reducing safety, both for users of the road network, everything from motorcyclists to car users, good vehicles users and so on, and for workers. So both of those are assessed. And the actual safety performance, the most recent 5 years data, do show that all forms of smart motorway, controlled motorway, dynamic hard shoulder and all-lane running, they all have a lower collision rate than conventional motorway with a hard shoulder. And that might be counterintuitive, but that is the finding at the moment. And therefore, CIHT do support them, provided the environmental and economic case is clear. So David Metz flagged earlier the issue about induced traffic, for example. We think that's something that needs assessing. But on that basis, they are safer in performance than existing conventional motorways. And therefore, our view is that the case is made, but needs to keep being monitored, both collisions and driver behaviour.
So did you listen to the evidence from the witnesses beforehand? They took a very different view. Why is it that they come to a different view to you? Where have they got it, their modelling wrong?
So there's one of the things we find in road safety is that behaviour can be very counterintuitive. So some of the things that we've looked at in the last 10 years is things like removal of street lighting on rural roads, removal of pedestrian guardrail, change in urban design, street space. Things that people thought would be worse actually turned out to be better because behaviour is elastic. It changes in response to the environment. So a theoretical worsening of safety doesn't necessarily result in an increase in actual collision involvement, particularly for the high severity incidents. So it is counterintuitive. And my personal view when I started working in smart motorways was that it seemed high risk and counterintuitive. But what I've seen in that time, in the 13 years I've been working on it, is that the actual performance is different from what you might expect intuitively.
Thank you. And also, can I just applaud the length of your answers as well? It's really good for us to follow. As a result, Carl McCartney wants to come in. Carl.
Chairman. Kate, I'm going to come straight back at you if that's possible, because my feeling is counterintuitive as well. And I understand that you might be taking it in the round, and I can see that drivers on smart, as they're called, motorways or controlled motorways will act very different to those on other motorways that aren't smart or controlled or monitored or lower speed ensured motorways. So if we strip out from the data that you've seen, and I know that statisticians can use statistics like drunks use lampposts, how many accidents that have occurred or breakdowns on a normal motorway have resulted in deaths or really bad injuries compared to the number of similar type accidents stroke breakdowns on all lane running, rather than taking it in the round as the performance of the motorway as a whole? Because I would say that probably my intuition tells me that all lane running motorways are going to perform, if we want to use that word, worse.
So the stocktake reports, it was published in May this year, an update of the report a year ago. It reports conventional motorway having a fatality rate per mile travelled of 0.16, and that's the highest of all the types of motorway.
I'm going to stop you there, Kate, because you're not dealing with what I've just asked. I've asked specifically for where there's been accidents or breakdowns in a live running lane on a normal motorway compared to those on a live lane stroke smart motorway stroke controlled motorway. And I don't think at this point in time you or your colleagues have looked at that. You're looking at these statistics in the round, i.e. the whole performance of the motorway, and I don't think that helps us.
The stocktake does specifically give live lane fatalities. Table 1 in the stocktake document gives live lane fatalities in total, and it gives live lane fatalities per mile travelled. And the 5 live lane fatalities per mile travelled are lower on all 3 types of smart motorway than on conventional motorway for the last 5 years, 2015 to 2019. That's the 5 years for which we've got whole data. That's table 2 in the stocktake report.
Well, thank you for that, but I'm going to drill down. I've asked the questions I've asked. You know what I'm asking. I think we'll look at how those statistics and figures have come to, and if it's actually dealing with what I'm specifically asking and searching for. But thank you.
And so, Kate's given a view there that she feels that smart motorways are safer. So on that, but so perhaps, Kate, can I allude to the fact that you are then, as a result, comfortable with the continued expansion of the smart motorways network, just to make sure I'm not putting words into your mouth?
So there are 2 things we feel very strongly. One is that we understand that many drivers are very anxious about smart motorways, and that has a real potential effect. They might divert onto other roads. So a big concern for us is about communications and public understanding, because if people are fearful of smart motorways and they travel on A roads where they're far more likely to be killed per mile travelled, that's a real risk. So I have two sort of provisos for continuing with both retention and expansion. One is that driver communication and understanding is addressed, and the Transport Focus report addressed this very well, saying it's very important that we have the public on board and we keep addressing it. It's not a one-off issue. And the second is we must continue to monitor all incidents and collisions, and to understand what's happening, to inform ongoing design, operation, and public information. So we don't just say it's a done deal, because I don't think it is. The numbers are quite small statistically, and therefore the more time goes by, the more statistical validity they've got. But the principle is the public are concerned. They're not interested in statistics. They feel unsafe, and that matters. So they may be more safe in terms of fewer fatalities, but if they don't feel safe, then there's a danger they take decisions that actually make them more at risk.
Okay, thanks, Kate. So that's a really strong opening. Let's move now to the economic and business case for smart motorways and whether there are benefits which justify them. Over to Graham Morris.
Okay, thanks. Kate, I wonder if I might go to you, and it's the same question, but I wonder if I can put an additional aspect to it, and that's in relation to the government's plans to abolish motorways that have a dynamic hard shoulder. Is that the right decision? And again, this issue, are we comparing like with like? Do we know the relative benefits of each different type of smart motorway? Do we know enough to make those informed decisions? Kate?
Yeah, so when I first started working in it, my belief was that dynamic would be safer than all-lane running because we had the hard shoulder available off-peak times, so that if the driver did get into difficulty, they had somewhere to stop. One of the difficulties with that is it creates a more challenging environment, so drivers have more things to work out, which lanes are open, which are not, which speed limit can I go, which lanes to which destination at my downstream junction and so on. And it seems to have caused more of a challenge for drivers. ALR is the same all the time, so you have less uncertainty. So the theory is dynamic hard shoulder is safer, and the stock take does show it has a lower collision rate, albeit it fluctuates very widely from year to year, and therefore we need to be quite mindful that we need to keep monitoring that and understand it. So I do support the conversion to have less variability. You drive up the motorway, you might drive on a bit of standard motorway with a hard shoulder, then a bit of all-lane running, then a bit of dynamic hard shoulder on the hard shoulders open, then a bit of all-lane running, then a bit of hard shoulder on the hard shoulders closed. It can be quite challenging for drivers to continuously attend to what the environment is. So I think less variation, I think, is helpful. One of the important points is that most stops on motorways, including most stops in emergency areas, are illegal discretionary stops. And part of the challenge is to make sure drivers understand what they need to do to help themselves be safe, as well as what the highway authorities need to do. So tens of thousands of people run out of fuel in English motorways every year. Tens of thousands have tyre blowouts due to bald or incorrectly inflated tyres every year. So these are things that people could avoid by their own actions, keeping cars well maintained and so on. There are things that people can do themselves, and that combination for us is very important. So the all-lane running does show a better safety performance than conventional. Dynamic in theory is better, but it's more challenging and more confusing. And also you have to have staff in the control centre 24/7. You want to be able to open the hard shoulder 24/7, and that's not actually the case. So for a lean, more self-understanding network, we feel that's supported. And the methodology by which that's assessed is a complex, sophisticated hazard log with over 130 hazards, and each are scored for the frequency per mile per year, the chance of them causing a crash when they occur, and the likely severity of that crash is very carefully analysed to make sure it's properly understood and to identify what the design needs to do to make it safe. So I think there are good processes in place, but it definitely can be better. Two of the measures StockTake talks about improvement. One is stop vehicle detection, which I'm massively supportive of. We really feel that could be a huge benefit in speeding up the detection of somebody if they break down. People often don't ring in. They often don't ring 999. They might ring the breakdown company, but they might not ring 999. They might not call for help. So that's important. The emergency refuges is quite complex, and I haven't managed to find any evidence that says on the places where the refuges are closer together, they have a lower live lane breakdown than when they're further apart. Again, that's counterintuitive. At the moment, I don't think we have any evidence for that. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have sufficient refuge areas, but for example, if you put them near junctions where people are weaving left to right and right to left, you can actually make safety worse than better. You might create more scenarios for people to do hazardous things, so we need to be very mindful of unintended consequences.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan, unless you've got very strong views that differ from those already expressed on dynamics, I know we're short of time, so I'll hand back to the chair.
Graham, thanks ever so much. The next section we want to drill into is the removal of the hard shoulder and the risks of a live lane breakdown. Kate's already taken us into that, but Ben, I'll hand over to you to explore further.
Yeah, I mean, Kate, you said that sort of a lot of these live lane breakdowns are caused by drivers not maintaining their cars properly or keeping their tyres or running out of petrol. But I mean, shouldn't we design motorways for that sort of human frailty?
It depends on how many lanes and how much impact you want. As Jonathan described, the objective is to provide the highest amount of capacity with no safety detriment. as efficiently as possible. If we want a hard shoulder as well as an extra lane for that capacity, then that's a big environmental impact. And actually, the safety evidence is it actually causes more crashes if you have a hard shoulder than if you don't. So there is a danger of providing a thing that makes people think they're safe rather than the thing that actually reduces injuries. There's some interesting research done looking at eye tracking when people are driving on a motorway with the time looking in the hard shoulder even when there's nobody there, which means all that time they're not looking in their lane. What we want is people looking in their lane and concentrating, and that gives us the best safety performance. If somebody does break down, because yes, we should be designing for all the things that happen, but we should also be holding drivers to account to comply with the law and not put other people at risk.
I mean, I think it was last March, wasn't it? The government said that overall smart motorways were safer, but not in every way. Now, some people might say, but hold on, if you're accepting a level of risk in one area to deliver a better outcome overall, that's a bit ethically sort of dodgy. What would your response be to that?
Yeah, the ethics for me is very powerful, and we'd ask ourselves what actually reduces collisions, not just what reduces theoretical risk. Because when we started scoring hazard logs, we were essentially overscoring the frequency of incidents. That there are fewer incidents than we expected, and that tells us that behaviour does change. So it is important. You shouldn't worsen one road user group's safety at the expense of another. So, for example, you shouldn't make it more dangerous for motorcyclists to make it safer for car drivers. That would be unethical. Making car drivers safer in net terms, fewer crashes per mile, for me is perfectly ethical. I don't have any problem with increasing one hazard and another. In net terms, the reduction in shunts, in lane changes, which are very high frequency incidents, not just live lane breakdowns. But shunts in moving traffic, not a live lane breakdown. They're really high frequency incidents, and if you add increased capacity, you do smooth traffic flow, and that's one of the things that reduces flow breakdown that causes crashes. So it is more complex than simply the one hazard. We definitely need to focus hard on that hazard and making it as safe as possible, but it should be a net approach of what makes people safer.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Ben. So, Kate, perhaps if I could just stay on that theme, because I think we've taken evidence before which suggests that car drivers are more likely to collide with cyclists who are wearing a helmet than not wearing a helmet, because they sort of assume that the person is actually not going to be as impacted. I mean, is there a similar sort of concept that you're giving us here with your analogy as well?
Yeah, definitely. Behaviour changes continuously in the face of the environment people are in. And it was mentioned earlier that on all-purpose trunk roads, for example, dual carriageways don't have as high an injury rate as you might expect. If the hard shoulder is a critical safety feature, you would expect hard shoulders to be dual carriageways to be much more hazardous and injury involved than they are. So it's a complex mixture of the physical environment people are in and the way they change their behaviour, and the technology on smart motorways feeds that. So as traffic starts to slow down due to congestion or an incident, further back up the road, reduced speed limits are set, and that's automatic. That technology very much smooths traffic flow, and it reduces the shunts, and often the shunts aren't where the breakdown occurs, they're further back up the road.
Kate, I should ask you the same question as well about the government's action plan and whether you feel it goes far enough and does the right job.
I think the measures currently proposed, I would support, and CIHT members are involved in this design and management on a daily basis, and what we see is the outcomes of injuries, and so we'd support anything that reduces the likelihood of those injuries. So I support the actions to make those improvements. Our motorways are already the best in Europe, among the very best in the world. All lane running is shown to have fewer collisions, even conventional motorway, but it doesn't mean you can't make it better. What's important is that we continue to monitor the behaviour, the occurrences, the near misses, and the collisions and their type to understand what is causing them. And it's often not what we think is causing them, so that we continue to use evidence, not intuition, to decide how to make things even safer.
Thank you. Carl.
Question for all three of you, but maybe Kate, as you were last in that previous question, I'll come to you first. If you had a job of designing a new motorway, or perhaps travelling to work every day for 2 hours on a motorway in maybe a car that was not very reliable, conventional car that wasn't very reliable, or an electric vehicle that was, perhaps it occasionally broke down catastrophically with no electric power, what type of motorway would you prefer to be on or to design?
So I do drive on smart motorways every week, both all-lane running and dynamic hard shoulder. I don't personally feel any less safe on any of them. Not just because of what I do, but be taught from an early age that you plan your journeys, you make sure you've got enough fuel and so on. That for me is what can I do to keep myself safe? And I don't feel less safe. I do think there's a concern about electric vehicles. They're two different things. They're not more likely to break down, and they have very reliable information about how many miles they can still travel with the current charge. There was some research done, relatively small data set, but useful, into when the red light came on, how many miles did people think they could travel? And it was a lot more miles than they could actually travel. And that's why people run out of fuel. They have optimism bias. Electric cars are actually very reliable. When they do break down, they can't be towed or pushed. So they do have extra challenges in the motorway safety.
Well, the fact that they're electrical and they won't be producing...
They're harder to put out.
The fact they're electrical and they weren't producing any light if it's the middle of the night is I would say, on an all-lane running motorway is pretty fearful. Have you ever broken down on a motorway, Kate? On a live lane motorway? No. Okay.
I've seen a lot.
Yep.
I've watched a lot of CCTV of breakdowns and seen the near misses of vehicles driving around and the shunts. So I've seen it, at work and personally.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. So I wanted to ask you about the stop vehicle detection technology, which I think I'm right in saying that you're all in favour of. Is that correct? Kate, as well. So the vehicle technology that detects whether you've stopped in a live lane, you're an advocate of that technology. Kate, can you hear me?
I lost your sound for a minute there.
Sorry?
I lost your sound for a minute there. Were you asking me a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to confirm. I didn't want to assume anything, but I'd be amazed if you're not in favour, that you all are in favour of the stopped vehicle detection technology. Yeah. So on that basis...
It's much more reliable than it was. There was some mention earlier of its reliability. It is much more reliable than it was when that research was undertaken, as I understand it.
So, back in time, I think in 2016, when the previous Select Committee did its report, we were given assurances by Highways England at that time that all future smart motorways would have that technology incorporated and they would retrofit. That's not occurred. And indeed, it's sort of somewhat galling to many that the government is now promising that will be delivered 12 months early in 2022. Some would say 6 years too late. What the government have said is that going forward, all new smart motorways will have to have that technology in place. Do you feel the government should go further, though, and say that no more smart motorways should be created until the retrofitting has occurred to the existing network when it comes to that technology? And Kate, where do you stand on that?
Yeah, so for me, I go with the data which says that all-lane running, even without stop vehicle detection, has a lower fatality rate than conventional motorway, but it still needs to be made much safer. So for me, the two do need to run in parallel. It's not an easy thing to implement. I think there's a perception you just chuck a couple of posts up and it's in. It is much more complicated than that. So I don't think any new scheme should be implemented without it. And I do think we should be implementing it as soon as we can on the existing schemes, and that is happening at the moment. But it is complicated. They are already safer, but they can be made more safe, and we should do that as quickly as we can.
So turning that on its head, I believe that the stretch of the M4, which was to be opened as a smart motorway, will now be delayed because of the need to put the stop vehicle technology in place. So Do you disagree with that delay?
I think it's finely balanced. I would. I haven't been personally involved in that one. I would. Excuse me. I would advocate the careful evaluation of the pros and cons. The stop vehicle detection definitely reduces the period that somebody is stationary before they're identified. If they don't ring in, and part of the problem is people don't call for help. That 17 minutes doesn't apply if somebody makes a phone call and the control centre knows about it. They don't need to wait till they've detected it using technology if somebody actively alerts them to it. So it's not only that technology that does that. In terms of delaying a scheme, provided it's safe in the interim, in a roadworks condition and temporary condition, we do careful risk analysis of schemes when you do that handover process, when you're going from the roadworks stage into the operational stage. That's very carefully managed. So provided that process is followed, which I certainly would be, then I wouldn't have any concern about a delay, provided in that interim period it's safer, and the risk assessment would take us to that.
And the last question I had, I'll ask members if they had any more, was about the culture of Highways England. I mean, Highways England does appear to have sort of got itself into a bit of a difficult position with regard to smart motorways, and that may be unfair if you believe, as you do, that overall they are safer. Where do you think Highways England has perhaps got it wrong? I'll go to Kate first of all.
I think we could perhaps have anticipated the driver anxiety and that response if people weren't aware of what was being done and why. And I don't think there is high public understanding. Drivers are inherently inconsistent. They simultaneously think the hard shoulder is a safe place, evidenced by the millions of stops made on it illegally every year for discretionary stops, and also that all lane running is very dangerous, which suggests they think the hard shoulder is a safe place, but motorways are not. So I do think we have an inconsistency in that. Highways England need to not only deliver the safest infrastructure, but they also need to bring the public with them. So I think with hindsight, that could have been identified. I wasn't involved in this at that time, so I couldn't comment on what was or wasn't known or should or shouldn't have been done. But understanding that for future communications, I think is really important, being respectful of that fear, because the fear is real. It doesn't matter whether people are less likely to die per mile travelled. If they feel fearful, that's what changes their behaviour.
Thank you, Kate. Can I just thank you very much, Jonathan, Kate and Becky, for giving us your views. Very different views you had to the first panel, and it's absolutely right that this inquiry takes a good balanced view. So thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your day. Order, order.